He wasn't supposed to find anything in that place, but the dog already knew something was waiting. The first thing Officer Daniel Hayes noticed wasn't the silence. It was how complete it felt, like the world had stepped back and decided not to breathe near that cave. The property sat just outside a forgotten stretch of road in northern Arizona, miles from the nearest gas station, tucked into a jagged hillside where the desert gave way to stone. $400 had bought him the deed, a rusted key, and a handshake from a man who wouldn't meet his eyes. It didn't make sense, not for land like this, not even for something half buried in rock. But Daniel wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for distance. Distance from the noise, from the city, from the cases that didn't close neatly. The ones that stayed with you long after the paperwork ended. Rex stepped out of the truck first, his paws landing softly against the gravel, ears already alert, scanning, reading the space in a way no human ever could. A German shepherd trained for detection, yes, but more than that, a partner who had learned to trust instinct over instruction. Daniel followed, boots crunching as the wind brushed lightly across his jacket, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and something colder, something that didn't belong in open air. The entrance to the cave house was carved into the rock face, reinforced by old timber that had darkened with age, the door slightly crooked as if it had settled over time. It looked less like a home and more like something that had been hidden on purpose. Daniel paused at the threshold, fingers tightening around the key before he pushed it into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first, then gave with a dull click that echoed too loudly in the quiet. Rex didn't wait. He stepped inside ahead of him, moving slowly, deliberately, his body low, nose working the air in short, controlled breaths. The temperature dropped immediately, a coolness that wrapped around Daniel's arms and settled into his chest. The light from outside stretched thin across the stone floor before fading into shadow, leaving the deeper parts of the cave swallowed in a dim gray that felt older than the structure itself. There was no hum of electricity, no distant traffic, no birds. Just the faint drip of water somewhere deeper within, steady and patient, like time marking something unseen. Daniel exhaled slowly, letting his eyes adjust, taking in the rough walls, the narrow hallway leading further in, the sparse furniture left behind as if someone had walked out and decided never to return. Well, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the dog, we've seen worse. Rex didn't respond. He had stopped moving. His body went still near the left wall, head tilted slightly, ears forward, eyes fixed on a section of stone that looked no different from the rest. No barking, no sudden movement, just attention, focus, the kind that meant something had already been understood before Daniel could even begin to ask the question. He stepped closer, boots quiet now against the packed earth, watching the dog instead of the wall. Rex lifted one paw slowly and placed it against the surface, not scratching, not digging, just resting it there as if feeling for something beneath. The gesture was small, almost gentle, but it carried weight. Daniel felt it in his chest, that subtle shift, the same one he had learned to trust on patrol, the moment before a truth revealed itself. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer wouldn't come in words. Rex didn't look back. He stayed fixed on that spot, breathing slow, steady, certain. And in that stillness, in that silence that pressed in from every side, Daniel realized something that made the back of his neck tighten just slightly. This place wasn't empty. It had just been waiting for someone who knew how to listen. Daniel did not touch the wall right away, not because he was afraid, but because he had learned the cost of moving too quickly when something did not feel right. He crouched beside Rex instead, lowering himself to the same level, studying the surface the dog refused to look away from. Up close, the stone was uneven, rough in most places, but here there was a subtle difference, a faint line that did not belong to nature, a seam that had been shaped by hands, not time. It was almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, unless you had someone like Rex showing you exactly where to see. The air felt cooler near that section, not dramatically, but enough for the skin on Daniel's forearms to notice. He ran his fingers along the edge, slow and careful, feeling the slight shift in texture where the rock met something else beneath. Someone worked on this, he murmured quietly, more certain with each passing second. Rex's tail remained still, his body steady, but his breathing had changed, just enough to signal that whatever had been here was not recent, yet not forgotten either. Daniel stood and reached for his flashlight, clicking it on and angling the beam across the wall. The light slid over the surface, catching small imperfections until it settled into the narrow line, revealing it more clearly now, a hidden outline that suggested a sealed opening. Not a natural formation. A choice. He stepped back slightly, scanning the room again, as if expecting the space to react, but nothing moved. The silence held. The drip of water continued somewhere deeper, patient as ever. "All right," he said under his breath, the decision forming without force. He moved toward his pack and pulled out a small pry bar, the metal cool against his palm. It was not heavy duty, just something he carried out of habit, the kind of tool that often proved useful when situations turned unpredictable. He returned to the wall and positioned the edge carefully into the seam Rex had indicated. For a moment, he paused, listening again, not for sound, but for that internal signal that told him whether to proceed. It came quietly, the same way it always did, a calm certainty rather than urgency. He applied pressure. At first, nothing happened. The stone resisted, holding its place as if it had been undisturbed for years. Then, slowly, there was a faint shift, a soft grinding sound that echoed just enough to confirm movement. Dust fell in thin streams, catching the flashlight beam like drifting ash. Rex stepped back slightly but did not retreat, his eyes fixed, watching every inch as the edge began to give way. Daniel adjusted his grip and pressed again, more firmly this time. The seam widened just enough to reveal darkness beyond, deeper than the room itself, a hollow space where the light struggled to reach. A breath of colder air slipped through the opening, carrying with it a scent that made Daniel's chest tighten slightly, not unpleasant, not sharp, but old, like something that had been sealed away from the world for a very long time. He stopped, lowering the pry bar for a moment, letting the space breathe, letting whatever was behind that wall exist again in the present. Rex moved closer once more, careful, deliberate, placing his nose near the opening without crossing it, as if respecting an unseen boundary. "Easy," Daniel said softly, though his own voice felt quieter than usual, absorbed by the stone around him. He widened the gap just a little more, enough to fit his hand through, then his flashlight. The beam cut into the darkness, revealing only the first few feet, a narrow passage sloping gently downward, the ground uneven, the walls closer together. It was not large, not built for comfort. It was built to be hidden. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of understanding settling in, not as fear, but as recognition. Places like this were never accidental. They were chosen, shaped, and then forgotten by everyone except those who needed them to remain exactly as they were. He glanced at Rex, who finally looked back at him, just once, a brief meeting of eyes that carried more meaning than any command ever could. Then the dog turned again toward the opening, ready, waiting, as if this had always been the path they were meant to take. Daniel did not rush into the opening, even though every instinct told him they had already crossed a line the moment the wall gave way. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight and leaned forward just enough to widen the beam into the passage, letting the light settle before his feet followed. The ground sloped gently downward, no more than a few degrees, but enough to shift the balance in his steps, forcing him to move slower, more deliberate, as if the cave itself required patience to be understood. Rex entered first, not out of impulse, but out of certainty, his movements. Measured, shoulders low, ears forward, each step placed with quiet precision. The air inside felt different from the main chamber, heavier, as though it carried the weight of time rather than dust. Daniel noticed how the sound of his own breathing seemed to soften here, absorbed by the narrow walls, leaving only the faint echo of the water drip behind them, now more distant, more like a memory than a sound. The beam of light revealed markings along the stone, not writing, not symbols meant to be read, but scratches, subtle indentations that suggested repeated contact, as if someone had moved through this space often enough to leave a quiet trace of their presence. He ran his hand lightly along the wall as he walked, not searching for anything specific, but grounding himself in the reality of the space. The stone was cool, almost damp, yet steady, unchanged. "This was used," he whispered, the words barely more than breath. not meant to be heard beyond the small circle of light they carried. Rex paused again several feet ahead, his body angled slightly to the right where the passage curved, his tail still, his attention fixed forward. Daniel stopped as well, not because he saw something yet, but because Rex had. That was always enough. The curve opened into a slightly wider area, not a room, but a space that allowed the light to expand, revealing the outlines of objects placed with intention. A small wooden crate sat against the far wall, its edges worn but intact, the surface coated in a thin layer of dust that had not been disturbed in a long time. Beside it, a metal lantern rested on the ground, old but not rusted through, as if it had been protected from the elements by the very secrecy of the place. Daniel approached slowly, crouching beside the crate, brushing away the dust with the back of his hand. The wood creaked softly under his touch, not breaking, just acknowledging that it had not been opened in years. He lifted the lid carefully, half expecting resistance, but it opened without protest. Inside were items arranged not in chaos, but with care. A folded piece of cloth, faded but clean. A canteen, empty but sealed. And beneath them, something that caught the light in a way that did not belong to the rest. Daniel reached in and lifted it gently, his fingers tightening just slightly as he recognized the shape before his mind allowed the thought to fully form. It was a badge, not polished, not new, but unmistakable. The engraved surface reflected the beam of the flashlight, revealing the worn lettering of a name that had not been spoken in years, at least not out here. Daniel's breath slowed, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition pressing quietly into his chest. He did not speak the name aloud. He did not need to. Rex stepped closer, lowering his head near the crate, not sniffing with urgency, but acknowledging, as if he understood that this was more than an object. It was a piece of someone who had once stood where they now stood. Daniel turned the badge slightly, letting the light trace over its edges, noticing the faint scratches, the small imperfections that only came from time and use. This had not been lost. It had been left. Deliberately. He set it down carefully on the edge of the crate and looked deeper into the space, beyond what the light could fully reveal, where the passage seemed to continue further into shadow. The realization settled in quietly, without drama, without shock. This place was not just hidden. It had been lived in, waited in, remembered by something that had never truly left. Rex moved forward again, one step at a time, his presence steady, guiding without force, as if the path ahead was not something to fear, but something that had been waiting for them long before they arrived. Daniel did not pick the badge back up right away, not because it lacked importance, but because he understood that some things needed a moment before they were moved, as if the space itself had to acknowledge the shift. The air felt still, heavier now, as though the presence of that small piece of metal had changed the weight of everything around them. He remained crouched for a few seconds longer, eyes tracing the crate again, then the lantern, then the faint impressions in the ground that suggested more than one visit, more than one moment lived within these walls. "You stayed down here," he whispered, not asking a question, but recognizing a truth that had been quietly preserved. Rex had already moved a few feet ahead, his body angled toward the darker end of the passage, not pulling forward, not rushing, simply holding position as if marking the next point of attention. Daniel stood slowly, brushing his hands against his jeans, and took one last look at the badge before stepping away from it, trusting that it would still be there when they returned. The passage narrowed again beyond the small clearing, the walls drawing closer, forcing Daniel to turn his shoulders slightly as he moved forward. The beam of the flashlight stretched longer now, catching the uneven floor and the faint curve of the path ahead. But there was something else, something subtle that shifted in the air the deeper they went. It was not a smell in the usual sense, not sharp or distinct, but a layered scent that carried traces of fabric, metal, and something faintly human, not fresh, not recent, but present enough to be noticed. Rex slowed his pace, his ears twitching slightly, as if tracking something that could not be seen, his nose lifting just briefly before returning to the ground. Daniel watched him carefully, reading every movement, every pause, every small adjustment. This was not alert behavior driven by training alone. This was instinct layered with memory, even if that memory did not belong to Rex himself. The path dipped slightly more, No more than a few inches, but enough for the light to catch something ahead that did not match the stone. Daniel stopped again, narrowing the beam, focusing it forward until the shape became clearer. It was a chair. Not large, not heavy, but unmistakably placed. A simple wooden chair, positioned against the wall as if someone had once sat there for long periods of time, facing the direction they were now approaching. The legs were steady, not broken, the surface worn smooth in places where hands might have rested. It was not abandoned carelessly. It had been left exactly where it belonged. Rex approached it slowly, circling once, his tail low but relaxed, then stopped beside it, his head turning slightly, as if following an invisible line of sight from the chair into the deeper darkness beyond. Daniel stepped closer, his chest tightening just slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet understanding that this was no longer just a hidden space. It was a place of waiting. He ran his fingers along the back of the chair, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the faint grooves left by time and use. "You were watching something," he said softly, the words barely carrying beyond the space between him and the object. He shifted the light again, angling it past the chair, deeper into the passage, and that was when he saw it. Another opening. Smaller, lower, almost concealed by the natural curve of the stone, but there, just beyond the reach of the chair's view. The beam caught the edge of it, revealing a narrow entrance that seemed to lead further down, not just forward, but into a deeper layer of the cave itself. Rex moved toward it immediately, not hesitating, but slowing as he approached, lowering his body slightly, his movements becoming more deliberate than before. Daniel followed, each step quieter now, as if the cave had taught him how to move within it. He paused at the edge of the second opening, crouching slightly to bring the light inside, but the beam only reached a few feet before being swallowed again by shadow. The air that drifted out from within was cooler still, carrying that same layered scent, but stronger now, more defined, like a memory that refused to fade. Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip tightening just a little on the flashlight, not out of tension, but out of focus. Behind him, the crate, the badge, the chair, they all remained exactly where they had been, silent witnesses to whatever had once taken place here. In front of him, the path continued, deeper, quieter, waiting. Rex glanced back once, just briefly, meeting Daniel's eyes with a calm certainty that needed no command. Then he turned again and stepped into the darkness ahead, trusting that Daniel would follow, just as he always had. The opening forced Daniel to lower himself further, his shoulders brushing against the cool stone as he stepped into the narrower passage, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly with each measured breath he took. The air here was colder, not sharply so, but with a depth that settled into his lungs, as if this part of the cave had been untouched by the outside world for far longer than the rest. Rex moved ahead with quiet certainty, his body close to the ground now, navigating the tight space with a familiarity that did not belong to instinct alone, but to something deeper, something that felt almost like guidance. The walls pressed closer, the ceiling dipping just enough to force Daniel to bend slightly, each step slower than the last, not out of hesitation, but respect for the silence that seemed to hold everything together. The beam of light revealed the floor more clearly now, and that was when Daniel noticed the change. The ground was no longer just uneven stone. There were marks, subtle at first, but unmistakable once seen. Patterns of wear, faint impressions that suggested repeated movement along this exact path. Not random, not natural. Someone had walked here, again and again, careful, deliberate, leaving behind a quiet record that time had not fully erased. Daniel crouched briefly, running his fingers lightly across the surface, feeling the shallow indentations beneath the thin layer of dust. "You kept coming back," he murmured, the words soft, almost absorbed before they could echo. Rex paused a few feet ahead, his head lifting slightly, as if catching something just beyond the reach of the light, then lowering again as he continued forward. The passage began to widen gradually, the pressure of the walls easing, allowing Daniel to straighten his posture as the space opened into something larger. Not a room, not exactly, but a chamber that felt more intentional than anything they had seen so far. The ceiling rose several feet higher here, and the air seemed to shift, carrying a faint stillness that was different from before. Not empty, held. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the space, revealing more than just stone this time. Along one side of the chamber, there were shelves carved directly into the rock, simple but precise, each one holding small objects placed with care. A folded blanket, worn but intact. A metal cup. A small notebook, its cover faded but preserved by the dryness of the cave. Daniel stepped closer, his movements quieter now, as if he had entered a place that demanded a certain kind of presence. He reached toward the notebook, hesitating just briefly before lifting it gently into the light. The pages were yellowed, edges curled slightly, but still whole. He did not open it yet, not because he did not want to know, but because he understood that whatever was written inside had been left here for a reason, and that reason was not something to rush. Rex moved further into the chamber, his attention drawn toward the far side where the wall curved inward, forming a shallow recess that the light had not yet fully reached. Daniel followed, slipping the notebook carefully into his jacket pocket, his hand resting against it for a moment as if grounding himself in its presence. As he approached the far side, the beam of light revealed something that caused him to stop without thinking. A small arrangement of stones, stacked deliberately, not high, not decorative, but purposeful. In front of it lay a simple object, placed at its base. Daniel knelt slowly, bringing the light closer, his breath steady but quieter now. It was a pair of worn gloves, folded neatly, their surface marked by time but not neglect. They had been placed here, not dropped, not forgotten. Rex stepped beside him, lowering his head near the stones, his nose hovering just above them, not touching, as if acknowledging something that no longer moved, but still remained. Daniel did not speak for several seconds. He did not need to. The meaning of the space, the intention behind every object, every mark, every careful placement, it all settled into him without explanation. This was not just a hiding place. It was a life lived in quiet, in waiting, in isolation chosen or forced. And somehow, without understanding how, he knew they were not at the end of it yet. Because beyond the stone arrangement, just barely visible at the edge of the light, there was another path, narrower, deeper, leading further into the unseen. And Rex was already looking toward it, steady, certain, as if the story beneath this ground had not finished telling itself. Daniel did not reach for the deeper path immediately, even though Rex had already fixed his gaze on it with quiet certainty, because something in him understood that the space they stood in now was not meant to be passed through without acknowledgement. He remained kneeling beside the small arrangement of stones, his eyes resting on the gloves, taking in the careful way they had been folded, the way they sat untouched by time, as if waiting for hands that never returned. The stillness here felt different from the rest of the cave, not just silence, but intention, as if this chamber had been shaped not only by physical presence, but by memory itself. He reached out slowly and picked up one of the gloves, turning it gently in the beam of the flashlight, noticing the worn fabric at the fingertips, the faint creases where fingers had once bent and worked, lived and held onto something. There was no damage, no sign of struggle, only use, steady and consistent, like a life that had continued quietly beneath the surface of the world. Rex lowered himself slightly beside him, not lying down, but settling into a still posture, his breathing calm, his eyes soft but focused, as if he understood that this moment was not about movement, but about recognition. Daniel placed the glove back exactly where it had been, careful not to disturb the arrangement, then rose slowly, his attention shifting once more toward the darker passage beyond. This time, when he stepped forward, there was no hesitation. The path ahead was narrower than before, forcing him to angle his body sideways for a few steps before it opened just enough for him to move normally again. The air here was colder still, carrying that same layered scent, but now there was something else beneath it, something faint but undeniable, like the lingering trace of human presence that had not fully disappeared. The flashlight beam cut forward, revealing a gradual descent that felt deeper than any they had taken so far, the slope more pronounced, the walls more uneven, as if this section of the cave had not been shaped as carefully as the others. Rex moved ahead with quiet confidence, his steps slower now, more deliberate, his nose occasionally lifting toward the air before returning to the ground, following something that could not be seen, only sensed. Daniel followed closely, his own breathing steady, his mind no longer searching for answers, but allowing them to come as they would. The passage widened again after several yards, opening into a space that felt less like a chamber and more like a threshold, a place between what had been discovered and what still remained hidden. The floor here was smoother, not naturally so, but worn down by repeated contact over time, and at the center of the space lay something that drew Daniel's attention immediately. A small table, simple and sturdy, placed carefully against the far wall. It was not large, but it stood with quiet purpose, its surface holding only a single object. Daniel approached slowly, the beam of the flashlight steady now as it settled on the item resting at the center. It was a radio. Old, compact, the kind used years ago, its casing worn but intact, the knob still in place, the antenna folded neatly along its side. It was not broken. It had been preserved. Daniel reached out and touched it lightly, his fingers brushing against the surface, feeling the faint layer of dust that had settled without being disturbed. "You were waiting," he said softly, the words forming without thought, because the meaning was already there. Not hiding, not escaping, waiting. Rex stood beside him, his body still, his gaze shifting between Daniel and the space beyond the table, as if the radio was not the end of the story, but a part of something larger. Daniel lifted the device gently, turning it slightly in his hands, noticing the small details, the care with which it had been kept, the absence of damage, the quiet sense that it had once been used often, perhaps the only connection to a world that existed far above the stone. He set it back down slowly, exactly as he had found it, then raised the light again, scanning the far wall. And that was when he saw it. A narrow opening, barely visible, hidden in the curve of the stone just beyond the table, leading even deeper, further than anything they had seen so far. The beam of light reached only a few feet into it before fading, swallowed by a darkness that felt heavier than the rest. Rex took a single step toward it, then stopped, his body tense for the first time since they had entered the cave, not in fear, but in awareness. Daniel felt it too, that subtle shift, the quiet signal that whatever lay beyond that final opening was not just part of the past, but something that still held meaning in the present. He did not speak. He did not move forward yet. He simply stood there beside Rex, both of them facing the darkness ahead, understanding without words that they had come to the edge of something that was waiting to be fully revealed. Daniel did not step forward immediately, because the kind of silence that waited inside that final opening was different from everything they had passed through so far. It was not just absence of sound, it was presence without movement, like something that had already been decided long before he arrived. Rex stood still at the threshold, his posture firm but controlled, ears forward, body aligned with the darkness ahead, not resisting it, but acknowledging it, the way he always did when something mattered. Daniel lowered the flashlight slightly, letting the beam soften before lifting it again, guiding the light into the narrow opening just enough to see the first few feet. The passage beyond did not slope the same way as the others. It leveled out, straight and contained, as if it had been shaped with a clearer purpose, not for storage, not for waiting, but for something final. He took a slow breath and stepped forward, the shift in temperature immediate, cooler again, but steadier, less shifting, as though the air itself had settled here and refused to move. Rex entered first, his paws silent against the ground, his pace slower than before, each step measured not by caution, but by awareness. Daniel followed, his shoulders brushing the stone lightly as the space guided him forward, the beam of light stretching just far enough to reveal the outline of what lay ahead without fully exposing it. The passage did not last long, only a few yards, before it opened into a small, contained chamber, one that felt unlike any they had seen so far. It was not arranged for living, not for storing, not for watching. It was arranged for stillness. Daniel stopped at the edge of it, the light settling slowly across the floor, then lifting just enough to take in the full space. There was no clutter, no scattered objects, no signs of movement. Only one thing rested at the center. A simple wooden bench, positioned carefully, facing the direction of the entrance, as if whoever had placed it there had wanted to see exactly what now stood in front of it. Rex stepped into the chamber and paused beside the bench, his head lowering slightly, his body quiet in a way Daniel had rarely seen. Not alert, not tense, but respectful. Daniel moved closer, each step softer than the last, the beam of the flashlight now steady, revealing more detail as he approached. The bench was worn, but not broken, its surface smooth from use, the edges rounded by time rather than damage. And beside it, resting gently against one of its legs, was something that made Daniel's breath slow without effort. A small metal box, no larger than a paperback book, its surface dull but intact, placed there with intention, not hidden, not protected, simply left. He crouched slowly, lowering the light so it rested across the box, revealing its simple latch, its edges, the faint marks that spoke of years rather than neglect. He did not open it immediately. He did not need to. The weight of everything they had seen, the crate, the badge, the chair, the gloves, the radio, all of it had led here, not to something dramatic, not to something violent, but to something complete. Rex lowered himself beside the bench, not lying fully down, but settling into a still posture, his gaze soft, fixed not on the box, but on the space around it, as if acknowledging something that could not be seen, but was still present. Daniel reached out slowly and rested his hand on the lid, not pressing, not lifting, just feeling the cool metal beneath his palm. The silence in the chamber held steady, unchanged, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment to exist again. He closed his eyes briefly, not out of hesitation, but to listen, not with his ears, but with the understanding that had carried him this far. When he opened them again, the decision was already made. He lifted the latch gently, the soft click echoing just enough to mark the moment, and slowly raised the lid. Inside, there were only a few items, but they were enough. A folded piece of paper, aged but preserved. A small photograph, its edges worn but the image still visible in the light. And beneath them, resting quietly, a second badge, identical in shape to the one they had found earlier, but different in one way that mattered more than anything else. The name engraved on it matched the one Daniel had not spoken aloud before, the one that had never been found. He did not say it now. He did not need to. The truth was already there, not hidden, not buried, just waiting to be seen by someone willing to follow the path all the way to the end. Rex shifted slightly beside him, his presence steady, grounding, as Daniel lowered the lid again, not to hide it, but to preserve it, just as it had been left. He stood slowly, his eyes moving once more across the chamber, taking in the bench, the stillness, the quiet order of it all. This was not a place of fear. It was a place of conclusion. And somehow, in the quiet way only a place like this could offer, it had given back something that had been missing for far too long. Daniel did not speak for a long moment after closing the metal box, not because there were no words, but because anything spoken too quickly would have diminished what the silence had already revealed. He remained standing beside the bench, the weight of the discovery settling into him not as shock, but as something steadier, something that felt like the final piece of a question that had been asked long ago. Rex stayed close, his presence quiet and unwavering, his eyes no longer searching, no longer tracking, but resting, as if the purpose that had guided him here had been fulfilled. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand brushing once more against the surface of the box before stepping back, allowing the space to return to its stillness, unchanged by their presence except for the fact that it had finally been seen. The photograph lingered in his mind, the faint image of a man whose face carried the same quiet determination he had seen in countless officers before, someone who had not disappeared without reason, someone who had chosen this place not out of fear, but out of necessity. The second badge confirmed what the first had suggested, that this was not a coincidence, not a forgotten story, but a chapter that had simply been waiting for someone to reach the end of it. Daniel turned slowly, his flashlight guiding the way back toward the passage, the beam now softer, less searching, as if it already knew where it needed to go. Rex rose and followed immediately, his steps calm, no longer leading, but walking beside Daniel in quiet understanding. The path back felt different, not shorter, but clearer, each space they had passed through now holding a meaning that had not been visible before. The narrow passage, the chamber with the table, the carved shelves, the worn chair, all of it formed a single line, a story told not in words, but in presence. When they reached the chamber with the radio, Daniel paused briefly, his eyes resting on it again, understanding now why it had been placed there, why it had been kept ready, even if it had never been used again. It had been a connection, a hope, a line that had remained open until it no longer could. He did not touch it this time. He did not need to. They continued back, moving past the gloves, the carefully arranged stones, the small signs of a life that had been lived in quiet determination, not erased, not forgotten, simply hidden from those who had not known where to look. When they reached the crate once more, Daniel stopped again, this time reaching down to pick up the first badge, the one that had started it all. He held it in the light, turning it slightly, letting the engraved name settle fully into his awareness. There was no doubt now, no question left unanswered. He slipped it carefully into his pocket, not as evidence, not yet, but as something that needed to be carried out of the darkness and back into the world above. Rex watched him for a moment, then turned toward the passage that led back to the main chamber, his posture relaxed, his steps steady. The climb back up felt longer, the incline more noticeable now, as if the cave itself was reminding them of the distance they had traveled, not just in space, but in understanding. When they finally stepped back into the first chamber, the shift in temperature was immediate, the air lighter, less dense, carrying with it the faint echo of the outside world that had seemed so distant before. Daniel moved toward the entrance slowly, the beam of his flashlight fading as natural light began to take its place, pale and soft against the stone. Rex stepped out first, his body lifting slightly as he crossed the threshold, his ears adjusting to the open air, the quiet sounds of wind returning in subtle waves. Daniel followed, pausing just outside the entrance, turning once more to look back at the doorway carved into the rock. It looked the same as it had before, unremarkable, still, as if nothing had ever been there at all. But now he knew. He took a slow breath, letting the air settle into his chest, the weight of the place still present, but no longer pressing, no longer unresolved. He reached down and rested his hand briefly on Rex's back, a quiet acknowledgement, not of a job completed, but of something deeper, something that could not be measured or explained. Then he turned away from the cave, the path ahead clear, not because everything had been solved, but because what needed to be found had finally been brought into the light, where it had always belonged. The sun was lower when Daniel finally reached the truck, its light stretching long across the desert floor, casting shadows that moved slowly with the wind, as if the land itself was breathing again after holding still for too long. He opened the door and paused before getting in, his hand resting on the frame, his eyes drifting back toward the hillside where the cave remained hidden in plain sight. From this distance, it looked like nothing more than rock and silence, just another part of the landscape that people passed without seeing. But he knew better now. Some places were not meant to be found by everyone, only by those who were willing to listen. When the world went quiet, Rex circled once before settling beside the truck, his posture relaxed, his work done not in the way commands defined it, but in the way something deeper had guided him from the very first step inside. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the badge, holding it in the fading light, letting the name catch the last of the sun as it reflected softly against the worn metal. He had seen that name before, not in person, but in files, in quiet conversations between officers who spoke with respect when certain stories were mentioned. A man who had disappeared without answers, whose absence had left a question that no one had been able to close. Until now. Daniel turned the badge slightly, his thumb brushing over the engraved letters, feeling the weight of it not as evidence, but as something returned. Something that had been waiting, just like everything else in that cave, not for recognition, but for completion. He slipped it carefully back into his pocket and climbed into the truck, the seat creaking softly beneath him as he sat in stillness for a moment before starting the engine. The sound broke the quiet, not harshly, but enough to remind him that the world outside the cave had never stopped moving. Rex jumped into the passenger side without being told, settling in with a calm that mirrored Daniel's own, his eyes forward, steady, as if he already understood where they were going next. The drive back felt different from the one that had brought them there, not because the road had changed, but because Daniel had. The weight he carried was no longer uncertain, no longer a question pressing against him without shape. It had form now. It had meaning, and it had a place to return to. By the time the lights of the small town appeared in the distance, the sky had shifted into deeper shades of blue, the first stars beginning to show above the horizon. Daniel slowed as he approached the station, the familiar building standing quiet under the evening sky, its windows glowing softly from within. He parked the truck and sat for a moment longer, his hand resting near his pocket, feeling the presence of the badge once more before stepping out. Rex followed closely, his movements calm, his attention steady, no longer searching, just present. Inside, the station carried its usual rhythm, low voices, the faint sound of a radio, the quiet movement of people finishing their shifts. Daniel walked past it all without urgency, his path clear, his purpose already formed before he crossed the threshold. He stepped into the evidence room and closed the door behind him, the click of the lock soft but final. For a moment, he stood there, the silence different from the cave, but just as meaningful. He reached into his pocket and placed the badge carefully on the table, the metal touching the surface with a quiet sound that seemed to carry more than its weight. Not hidden, not lost, found. He did not write the report right away. He did not call anyone in. Instead, he stood there, looking at it, allowing the moment to exist fully, without rushing it into process or procedure. Some things needed to be seen before they were explained. After a while, he exhaled slowly and reached for the file cabinet, pulling open a drawer that had not been touched in years, the name already in his mind before he read it on the tab. He placed the badge inside, aligning it carefully, closing the drawer with a gentle motion that felt less like an ending and more like a return. When he stepped back outside, the night had settled fully, the air cooler, the town quieter. Rex waited near the truck, his silhouette steady under the streetlight, his presence unchanged, as it always was. Daniel walked over and rested his hand briefly on the dog's back, not in praise, not in command, but in understanding. Some stories did not end with noise or celebration. Some ended in silence, in the quiet way truth finds its place when it is finally seen. He looked up once more at the sky, the stars clearer now, distant but constant, and for the first time in a long while, the weight he carried felt lighter, not because it was gone, but because it had found where it belonged. And beside him, Rex stood still, as if he had known all along that some truths do not need to be chased. They only need someone willing to follow, step by step, until the light reaches them.